Let's look at the stories on the front and inside the papers this morning. Jonathan Gibson joins me to do that, political commentator. Jonathan, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And you?
Very well. Should we start with this claim from the Home Secretary that Britons will forget how to work because we've become too reliant on immigration? What do you think?
This is an interesting one. I think when she was going through the list of jobs, I'm not necessarily convinced that there's a significant amount of, technical skill which we'll forget how to do when it comes maybe to fruit picking or lorry driving. I'm slightly cynical that this might be just an excuse to gain votes. She's clearly, facing a big challenge alongside the Conservative Party after
What
the
do you
local
mean,
elections.
to gain votes?
Sorry?
What do you mean about gaining votes?
As in clearly immigration, there's been a very big disjuncture in recent years between what politicians have been trying to think about immigration. They've been far more pro-immigration on average than what British public necessarily stance on it. And I think that's why we saw, Brexit happening. The areas with the highest rate of change in immigration were most likely to vote for immigration. And clearly there's a lot of people who have become very disenfranchised with the Labour Party after there has been growing net migration over the last few years. So I think she's more trying to settle those bits of areas of unrest within the UK.
Yeah, she's firing a bit of a warning shot to some of her colleagues, isn't she, by saying, don't get in the way of my proposals that will reduce immigration.
Absolutely. But some people in the Conservative Party clearly aren't as supportive. Grant Shapps is not willing to come out publicly and talk about it. And to be honest, a lot of the figures, for example, this year have been inflated through what I would describe as excellent work on some of the refugee crisis, such as, the Hong Kong refugees, the Ukrainian refugees, even though we've let in, for example, less Afghan refugees than most European countries, that's also going to be a part of these numbers. It's not necessarily simply economic migrants that are coming into and factoring into the equation. So I think it's important to recognise in this conversation the vital role that refugees, not refugees but immigrants do, for example, in our NHS, and the importance of taking in people that are fleeing for their lives, because we need to be part of the international effort to do that.
You mentioned Brexit. The Daily Express says there's outrage over Labour's plan to reopen Brexit, saying Keir Starmer's been accused of trying to drag Britain back into the EU with his plan to give millions of its citizens the vote. How fair do you think that headline is?
I'm not sure it's quite fair, because I think he has tried to come out previously and say that we're not going back into the EU. He's trying to win back the red wall. That's one of his biggest policies. And I don't think, trying to return to the EU is necessarily going to do that. I think they're quite different, in terms of allowing 16 and 17-year-old the vote. It's not something that's necessarily, clearly trying to manipulate the. Obviously, they're naturally going to be slightly more Labour tending, but I don't think it's naturally so unfair if we're trying to, get younger people more involved in politics who are, currently one of the lowest voter turnout regions. It might be quite an effective way. And so, yeah, obviously there might be some sort of political reason to do so. However, there is also a justification, particularly when it comes to the age discrepancy over, allowing these people to have the vote. I don't think he's necessarily saying, that we're going to rejoin the EU. That's not necessarily one of his plans, but, the population and demographic has changed. We never properly qualified what sort of Brexit we wanted. And I think, he's trying to just make changes which can be seen as justified and do ultimately benefit the Labour Party.
Yeah, so it's not just about giving EU citizens the vote, but also 16 and 17-year-olds, of course, is highly controversial. Would you be in support of that?
I think, to be honest, I don't see any big reason why we shouldn't be, to be honest. There's no voting qualification in terms of literacy rate or anything like that. And I speak to lots of 16, 17-year-olds, they're just as engaged, if not more, with politics. And involved in, political conversations as, people are far older. When, for example, I was being massively impacted, my education was being impacted by the school's lockdown. For example, young people were not really brought into the conversation, or, when it comes to housing, for example, and things like that, which really do affect young people's futures. And there are lots of policies and lots of things going through which do affect young people. I think it's really important to bring them into the conversation and ensure that their perspectives are heard. And I think, one of the most effective ways of increasing turnout and bringing people into this conversation is political enfranchisement of younger people. And I think it's unfair to say they're simply too naive. And, maybe they haven't had the same experience, but there are people who are 16 and 17-year-olds who are far more politically engaged than people who are far older than themselves.
Yeah, and I'm sure if we had a Conservative voice on the programme, they would be saying quite the opposite. Jonathan, let's talk about the livelihoods of young people, because pretty much all of the papers have covered this story. I'm looking inside the Times, and the headline is really quite shocking. A tenth of children aged 16 to 18 want to change their gender or have already done so. It's a report from a think tank called Civitas, and it found that more than 3/4 of parents want the legal right to see all sex and relationship education materials used in school lessons. What do you think is happening? Why has there been this shift where gender dysphoria and people having those acutely stressful and distressing situations that they're going through is so significantly on the rise?
It was really interesting, and I was also quite shocked to see this headline. I had no idea, to be honest, it was this high in my experience. I've just finished school and my first year of university. It was not that high necessarily while I was at school, but I think it's interesting because there's no clear, broad regulation when it comes, for example, to sex education in schools. And a lot of the time it's teachers doing this, might have their own personal biases and preferences. They might not be experts in terms of what they're educating about. And, in my experience, they certainly necessarily weren't. I wouldn't say, levels of sex education are particularly sophisticated. I'm not sure necessarily that, parent regulation is the solution, because, you get different parent bodies. Often, maybe if you think about particularly religious groups, for example, you might get particularly religious sects of parents that don't want, for example, children being educated about things like, for example, homosexuality or things like that. So I don't think the solution necessarily lies with parents, but I think there does need to be, however, a broader consistency and broader, consultation as to what exactly is taught within schools.
But do you think it's about the lessons and the curriculum that children are being taught in schools, which is causing this real disconnect that teenagers in particular, 1 in 10 older teenagers that are having with their gender?
So I think it's a multi-step process in many ways. I think, to be honest, a lot of it comes from social media, infographics, videos, TikToks. Most teenagers now, I think there was a statistic showing most of them receive their media and news information from websites like TikTok. They're no longer going to mainstream, news services as much anymore. And then, teachers, to be honest, probably pretty nervous when dealing with those sorts of issues, trans issues. And so there's not really people there to, answer questions, answer qualms. And they're getting sort of this echo chamber of, when you follow someone who might have, slightly more extreme views on social media, they're simply being reinforced, and there's no really, moderating force on that. So I think it's really important that we do have provisions in school, because, controlling and regulating social media in that respect is quite difficult. So having someone in school that can act as a sounding board to, is really knows what they're doing would be really important, in my opinion, for young people.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up social media as an issue. I want to segue very briefly, if we can. We can listen to the highlights, and I promise this is relevant to what happened at the BAFTAs last night. Sort of stars of the TV hit the red carpet, and let's just take a listen to some of the people who went home with a gong.
And the BAFTA goes to the traitors!
And the BAFTA for Best Leading Actress goes to Kate Winslet.
If I could cut this in half, I would give the other half to my daughter, Mia Threppleton. We did this together, kiddo.
And what Kate Winslet said, she ran for I Am Ruth. She played a concerned mother watching her teenage child become consumed by the pressure of social media. And Jonathan, I wonder what you make of what Kate Winslet said in her acceptance speech. She said, to the people in power who can make change, please criminalise harmful content. We don't want it. We want our children back.
Absolutely. I think this is so important for young people, you know. I know people, and there have been so many young people that, you know, get sucked into this echo chamber where they see harmful content online, whether that's about eating disorders, self-harm, or, you know, other things. And, you know, it becomes an echo chamber of these really harmful and really negative behaviors. There's not enough policing. We've seen, for example, the case of Molly Russell, the absolutely tragic consequences that can lead to, things like suicide, things like mental health disorders. You know, there's not the necessarily clamping down, and these platforms can be incredibly toxic. The algorithm works basically to make it that if you know, have access to one particular area, or if you look at one factor which is extreme, it will promote more and more of that extreme content because it keeps getting views and clicks. And there's some really harmful content out there. So I think social media companies absolutely need to do more to police this. You know, if we think about this, just because it's online doesn't mean that it's not, you know, as real or as, you know, visceral in its impacts. And there are so many teenagers that are being affected, as almost all teenagers have some sort of online presence on social media. And so I'm glad to see there are, you know, online bills which might be starting to come in, but it's definitely incredibly late for this to be happening already. And there needs to be
are you
more
nervous
done.
about your own social media use?
Sorry?
Are you nervous about how you use social media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly addictive. I actually don't have an Instagram account because I see, you know, how harmful it can be in many scenarios. I see, you know, even levels of, for example, body insecurity that come along with it. When you see, you know, everyone posting photos all the time and videos all the time of them at their best moments, you think, you know, you look at that and you think, oh, these people are happy all the time. When in truth, that's not actually reality. You know, people are making a facade on social media which isn't representative of real life, or, you know, when they're touching up all their images to make it, you know, look like they're in every photo looking the perfect image, when in reality, again, a lot of young girls and boys as well, actually, increasingly seeing this and looking at their own body and becoming more insecure about this. So I think, you know, it is a big issue. I think, you know, different platforms all have their own issues, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Snapchat. And I think it's really important and definitely time that we start to address this.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much. The final thing I'll mention, and it does feel like a bit of a segue, front page of the Times. What do you make of this idea, supposedly within the next decade, that you could go from London to Sydney in 2 hours?
Yeah, so almost reminded me of when I visited the Concorde Museum a few years ago, and they were talking about, you know, how fast you could travel. Back then, I never really thought that, you know, in the next decade it would necessarily come again. But yeah, it was quite shocking when I read about this. You know, I always thought that centrifugal forces were not to be messed with and quite dangerous in some ways for humans, but they seem to be suggesting, you know, there are ways around it. And, you know, it'll make space travel and, you know, traveling across the world far quicker. So, you know, it'll definitely boost productivity, increase, you know, the amount that we can do, be a bit of a game changer for holidays. So yeah, look, we're yet to see it. You know, it's still some bit away, and I will see it. I will believe when I see it. But, you know, it's quite an exciting prospect potentially.
Yeah, so cut a journey time down from 22 hours to 2. You have got to go via space, and it will cost about £350,000 per seat. So perhaps we won't be paying for a spot on the Virgin Galactic spaceship anytime soon. Jonathan, thank you so much. Jonathan Gibson is a political commentator with Young Voices UK.